Mr. Kouzes, to
Thank
Alliant
you,
International University. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Absolutely. In your book, Leadership Challenge, you talk about a number of things to do, obviously, with working with amazing people. What would you say leaders need to consider meeting the needs of future generations right now?
Well, one of the things we often get asked when we give a speech is kind of what's new and what's next and what's coming up for the millennials, what's coming up for Gen Y, Gen X. And so one of the things that Barry and I did was we actually investigated that question. We got a group of millennials together and we asked them things like, tell us about your situation, tell us about your values. And we looked at their responses to those kinds of questions and we found something quite amazing, quite surprising. There's no difference. There's no difference between Gen X and Gen Y responses to some fundamental questions about leadership. We used our leadership practices inventory, we compared generation by generation, and we found that demographics explain, and here we're in an academic setting, 0.02% of the variance of why leaders are effective. But 25 to 29% is accounted for by what you do, your behavior. So while there are some new circumstances, new challenges that every generation faces, whether it's boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, the fundamental practices of leadership have remained basically the same since we've started doing our research. And I'll make you a bet that 30 years from now, when we have done another 30 years of research, that we'll find fundamentally the same practices are applicable. That doesn't mean that circumstances don't change, but the behaviors of leaders are relatively stable.
Excellent. I think that's very interesting to know. Also in the book that I have here that's very well read on my part, you mentioned that leadership is really everyone's business.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Again, in our research in the book, we have examples, say Melissa Poe, who's now Melissa Poe Hood, but when we first met her, she was 8 years old.
Okay.
She's now 27 years old. And we wrote a story about her as a Girl Scout when she was 8 years old and wanted to do something about the environment. And today, 27 years old, 28 years old now, I think, she was just given the award for the American Association of University Women's Women of Distinction Award last year, 2009. And so we write cases about young people at 8 years old having causes to people 80 years old and 50 years old and 60 years old, people who are teachers, people who are educators, people who are frontline, people who are in not-for-profit, people who are in corporations, people in government and the military. Leadership is not the private reserve of a few charismatic men and women who somehow are born with some spectacular DNA that nobody can find.
Right. What would you say some of the bigger misconceptions about leadership are?
Well, we just talked about one, which is the sort of the myth that it's for some special group of people.
Right.
In fact, it's every generation, every age, every country. That leadership is everyone's business. A second misconception comes when people ask the question about born or made, which we get all the time. And leadership is definitely a set of skills and abilities. It is learnable, and when people engage in learning it, and they engage in more learning, they become more effective. That's probably no surprise to you at an educational institution.
Right.
I think another misconception is that there is leadership practices for the United States, and then there are leadership practices for China, and there are leadership practices for Australia, and there are a different set for European countries. In fact, we don't find that. While there are, again, some cultural differences which need to be respected, the fundamental practices, according to the data that we've gathered, are consistent from one place to the next to the next. So I think those are a few of the fundamental misconceptions, that leadership is in fact everyone's business, that it's cross-cultural. Cross-culturally there are some fundamentals that apply regardless of one's background or country of origin, and that it's a learnable set of skills and abilities.
That's an interesting point. The students that are attracted to the Marshall Goldsmith School of Management are also interested in working with people who are the best and the brightest in their field, but perhaps they need some help getting it to the next step. We're also interested in processes and systems and such. What would you say is the biggest value of what you do in working with leaders?
The biggest value that educators contribute is a discipline in practice. There is no great individual who has become great at anything who hasn't had to go through some learning.
Right.
You know, you just don't pop out of the womb stamped leader, and all of a sudden, you know, over the years you just mature and you become an even better one.
Right.
You learn to do it. You learn to play tennis. You learn to be a great athlete. You learn to be a great musician. And all the research suggests that anyone who's become an impresario, performer at whatever the discipline might be, has had a great teacher, or many great teachers, in fact, as they progress through their careers. So as educators, we need to remind ourselves that we play a fundamental role in the development of people who become the best. Coaching is also important. We never stop learning. The data says that in order to become the best leader, you have to continuously learn over time and practice about 2.7 hours a day every day for the rest of your life. And
wow.
So we need someone there to provide us with constant coaching. And also we need people around us. John Gardner, I'm sure you know the late John Gardner, who is, I think, one of the most respected and one of the most admired, and a mentor of ours, leadership educator in this country, once commented, "Pity the leader caught between unloving critics and uncritical lovers." Pity the leader who doesn't have someone who says, you know, I really care about you, and I need to give you some tough feedback. And I think the role of educators, the role of coaches, the role of consultants is to be that person who is the loving critic, who's there to help you improve by giving you the tough feedback and giving you some lessons along the way.